everybody. Welcome back to CMN 153. This is for our class for Thursday, the 28th of July, where I wanted to finish up our conversation about the internet and begin to talk about books. And as you know, we're at the point in the semester where now you've got a journal due on each of the media topics and media platforms that we're going to be discussing over the course of the semester. And basically, what I'm asking for is about a one-page response. Your first one would be about advertising and public relations. And in terms of that response, you can use any of the textbook material, any of the classroom material, and any of your own experiences. So I'm keeping it very open-ended. I'm not necessarily looking for a particular direction. I basically wanted some of your thoughts and ideas. There are things that you found to be interesting or perhaps confusing about the media topic that we discussed. And I'm grading that informally, not on a letter scale, but on a check mark scale. So I'm reading for grammar, or I'm not reading for grammar, I'm reading for content. Think of it as a kind of dialogue on paper or an expanded response to what we do with some of the discussion questions, which are a little bit more focused, but you've probably gathered that the discussion questions are meant to be also general enough so that you can respond in a multiplicity of ways, because I'm very interested in the dialogue. And certainly you don't need to respond to your classmates' discussion forum responses unless you felt moved to do so, but you should read all of the responses and my responses, because that gives you an idea of the classroom thinking and some of the classroom tone in regards to some of the media vehicles that we are discussing. And I had talked about how I wanted to start with the internet because of media convergence, that basically media has absorbed all other kinds of, the internet has absorbed all other kinds of media, and that now the internet is basically the vehicle for accessing all of those media. Not that you can't access those media in other ways as well. And that would lead us to talking about Tim Berners-Lee, which I had discussed briefly last class about his importance in terms of developing the World Wide Web and his recent work in terms of trying to rectify some of the challenges associated with his creation. And he has a 22-minute interview that I wanted you to watch. And you can see that the web link is below in our notes under internet. And that's on YouTube. YouTube is a wonderful thing. And it's entitled "On a Mission to Clean Up the Web in Conversation with Tim Berners-Lee." So he was talking about the importance of being able to have privacy on the internet and his new project called Solid as a way to try to create that level of privacy. And also, he has an interview with CBSN. Actually, CBSN News, and that's in 2018, and that's 6 minutes long, about how he is, well, for lack of a better word, devastated, quote unquote, by the web and its misuse, because it's certainly very different from his original conception. I thought that could put some closure onto what we've been discussing with the internet. And then we could work our way to chapter 10, which happens to be books. Perhaps the oldest mass medium, though I think about things like song that probably have existed, or music that have existed since the beginning of time. And we will talk about music as the semester progresses. When you think about the history of the book, and actually there's going to be a video that I'm going to ask you to watch that talks a little bit about the history of the book, but the textbook also talks about the history of the book. 2400 BC, so we're talking about Egyptian papyrus at this time and Babylonian clay tablets. And as you know, we've used these remnants to give us insight into the culture of that particular time period and those particular peoples. Parchment was when treated animal skin was used prior to paper. In the 4th century, you've got things like the Roman Codex. These are parchment sheets that were sewn together with leather that was wrapped around wood to serve as the kind of cover. From 400 BC to 1500, or actually from 400 AD to 1500, medieval manuscripts. And these were books that were printed and illustrated by hand. And one of the things about medieval manuscripts is that they are quite beautiful, but also incredibly labor intensive. So books were basically relegated to the very wealthy and also to religious authorities. It wasn't until 1450 where we get the Gutenberg printing press that allowed for movable type printing on parchment, where books could begin to be mass produced. So it was something that was accessible to large groups of people. And that meant that literacy rates could increase as well. What's the point of being literate if you can't necessarily have access to reading and writings of the time? 1800s is when the paperback book came about. This was when paper was made by machine with cloth covers. This reduced the cost dramatically. This is where we've got mass production and the access to information in a more democratic and egalitarian way. But information is dangerous, and we certainly are experiencing that in our own time period with some of the concerns about censorship. Now, books began to differentiate because there was a wider audience. Yes, you had the general reader books, the trade books, but you also had professional books that were devoted to specific populations or specific occupations. Textbooks that were focused on the population of students. I suspect you're quite familiar with the textbook. Religious books, and the Bible and all of its versions is the best-selling book of all time. Things like comic books and graphic novels. And in fact, what's interesting is that in 1950s, the Comic Magazine Association of America, in response to criticism that their works were too violent, decided to self-censor. This was the first time, really, that you've got a large media organization that decided to censor for itself rather than have censorship imposed from the outside. In university press, usually those are scholarly books. And again, as I had talked about with convergence with the internet, convergence has also just occurred with books because they've oftentimes been adapted to film and television vehicles and audio, and that was long before the internet. Some interesting points about books. Buenos Aires, Argentina, has more bookstores per capita than any other city, perhaps because there is no sales tax for books. So, in other words, books have the level of value in their culture to make them accessible to large portions of individuals without putting a tax in addition to the cost of the book. Iceland has a wonderful custom for Christmas. Christmas Eve, they exchange books and they spend Christmas Eve reading those books and eating chocolate. Sounds wonderful in my opinion. The holiday season begins for them where there's a free distribution of a catalog to every household about the new books that have been published. So maybe it's not too surprised that when we read about literacy rates, Finland is number 1, Norway is number 2, Iceland is number 3. Notice that the United States is not there. And I wanted to read you 2 quotes from 2 different texts. The first is an article entitled The Cult of True Womanhood, 1820 to 1850 by Barbara Welty. It was published in 1960, and it's an examination, actually, of female during the 1800s. And it's viewed through the lens of how female is portrayed in the popular media, which would mostly be magazines. But that also includes articles and novels and short stories as well, literature and poetry. And I always talk about this particular text in my Women in Literature class. But this quote, I think, was particularly appropriate for our class. Quote, "The female was dangerously addicted to novel, according to the literature of the period. She should avoid them," novels that being, "since they interfered with serious piety. If she simply couldn't help herself and read them anyway, she should choose edifying novels from the list of morally acceptable authors. The 19th century knew that girls could be ruined by a book. Books which attacked or seemed to attack women's accepted place were regarded as dangerous. And as much as things change, they remain the same." Again, when I talk about censorship in our current times. And a novel that you may be familiar with, Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. I highly encourage you to read it. It's a very interesting novel about a future set dystopian society where books have become outlawed. Because again, books are dangerous because they encourage thinking and they encourage knowledge. And in this novel, firemen no longer put out fires. They set fires. Basically, their job is to burn illegal books. So this is a place where the structures are fireproof, but the books are not. And that this quote, I think, is also particularly relevant when we discuss the significance and the danger associated with books. Just think about the prohibition to learn how to read and write in times of slavery, because, again, the dangers of knowledge associated with reading and writing. But the quote that I wanted to read you, and again, this is in our notes, quote, "A book is a loaded gun in the house next door," unquote. And do keep that in mind with our current debates about censorship. Though books have been censored probably since the beginning of time, but there have been periods where there have been more concerted efforts than others. So, a couple of the videos that I wanted you to watch on books. One is an 8-minute video that would give you a nice overview of the history of the book. It's entitled World of the Book, From Tablet to Codex and Beyond, the History of the Book. And this was done from the State Library, Victoria, approximately 8 minutes or so, in 2020. Not that we can visit the State Library in Victoria, but we can at least see the presentation that they gave. And also a very interesting YouTube video that I found that's approximately 14 minutes long. It's a little bit older. It was done in 2011. It's called What We Learned from 5 Million Books. So it's a very interesting study that was done by scanning literally 5 million books. So at the ending of all of this, our attendance question is devoted to books. And that will be due on the 30th, which happens to be Saturday at 1 p.m. But if you need an extension, please let me know. And note that the question has no right or wrong answer. It's more about your thinking. What do you think are the top 3 culturally significant books and why? What do you think are the top 3 culturally significant books and why? And I'm not necessarily asking you to identify a book that you've read. It's just something that's been culturally significant in our time, or perhaps in the past, or perhaps both. Feel free to raise this question with family, with friends, on social media. Feel free to visit libraries and bookstores and Amazon just to browse. Feel free to look at your own bookshelves and just think about if you had to identify top 3. And I'll share my top 3 too, but not now. I don't want to influence you. The top 3 culturally significant books and why. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about books and other forms of media. Take care. Bye-bye.